The first bell hadn't even rung, and the air in the sprawling, single-story complex of Northwood High was already thick with the scent of industrial cleaner and teenage anxiety. For Maya, a junior who preferred the quiet order of the library to the chaotic roar of the pep rallies, it was just another Tuesday. She was stacking returned copies of To Kill a Mockingbird when she noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible chill in the far corner of the fiction aisle. She shrugged it off, blaming the ancient, wheezing air conditioning system. But later, as she helped a freshman find a book on the Civil War, she saw him. A boy, maybe 16, with a shock of dark hair and a faded leather jacket, leaning against the shelves, staring right at her. He looked solid, real, but there was a translucency to him, like looking through old glass. Before she could speak, he was gone. She told her friends at lunch, but they just laughed. "You've been reading too much Stephen King, Maya," said Chloe, nibbling on a carrot stick. It was probably just a shadow, but Maya knew what she saw. The next day, she found a single, yellowed index card on the floor where the boy had been standing. On it, in a precise, old-fashioned cursive, was written, "Find me in the yearbook, 1964. Driven by a curiosity that overrode her fear, Maya spent her free period in the school archives, a dusty room in the basement that smelled of decaying paper and forgotten memories. She pulled the heavy 1964 yearbook from the shelf. The cover was embossed with the same school mascot, a falcon, but it looked fiercer, more angular. She flipped through the pages of smiling, black and white faces, their hairstyles and fashions a relic of a bygone era. And then she found him. His name was Leo Madsen. He had the same intense eyes, the same dark hair. His listed activities: chess club, debate team. His ambition: to get out of this town. There was no mention of how he died. It was the school librarian, Mrs. Gable, a woman who had been at Northwood since the late 70s, who filled in the blanks. Her voice dropped to a hushed, respectful whisper. "Leo Madsen," she said, her eyes clouding with a distant sadness. It was a tragedy. He was a bright boy, top of his class. He was working on a project for the state. Science fair in the old chemistry lab, the one they closed down after the new wing was built. There was an accident, a fire. They said it was quick. She looked at Maya, her gaze sharpening. "Why do you ask, dear?" Maya just mumbled something about a history project, but the connection was made. Leo wasn't a malevolent presence. He was a lonely one, a genius trapped in the place of his greatest ambition and ultimate failure. She started seeing him more frequently, a flicker in a corridor, a reflection in a window at dusk, always watching her with a quiet, pleading intensity. He began to communicate not with words, but with objects. A tarnished silver locket would appear in her locker, a faded photograph of a young woman Maya didn't recognize would be tucked into her calculus textbook. It was as if he was trying to tell her a story piece by piece. The story culminated one evening when Maya had stayed late to finish an essay. The school was eerily quiet, the usual daytime clamor replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights and the settling of the old building's bones. As she walked past the sealed-off wing that housed the old chemistry lab, she felt a pull, a physical sensation like a cold hand guiding her. The door, usually locked with a heavy deadbolt, was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, she was hit by a wave of cold air and the faint, acrid smell of smoke, decades old. Inside the lab was a time capsule. Beakers were coated in dust. Charts of the periodic table were faded and peeling. And there, at a lab table in the corner, sat Leo. He wasn't a flickering phantom anymore. He looked almost solid. He looked at her, and for the first time, he smiled. It was a sad, grateful smile. He pointed to a charred spot on the floor, then to his own heart, and then he simply faded, not with a pop, but like a sigh of relief, dissolving into the dusty air. In that moment, Maya understood. He hadn't wanted to scare her. He had been lost, and he just needed someone to see him, to acknowledge his story, to know that he had existed. He wasn't a horror story. He was a tragedy. And in being found, he was finally, after all these years, at peace. Maya never saw him again. But she sometimes felt a faint warmth in the library's fiction aisle, a gentle protective presence watching over her. Across the country, at the modern, glass and steel fortress known as Ridgeview Preparatory, A different kind of horror was unfolding. It didn't involve ghosts or things that went bump in the night. This horror wore a varsity jacket and a winning smile. Liam was a new sophomore, a transfer student trying to find his footing in the fiercely competitive social ecosystem. He was quiet, artistic, and preferred sketching in his notebook to shouting plays on the football field. This immediately made him a target for Mark and his crew. Mark was the golden boy, captain of the football team. Student council president, his future a paved road to an Ivy League school. But his charm was a weapon, and he wielded it with cruel precision. It started subtly, a misplaced textbook, a mocking comment about one of Liam's drawings left on the cafeteria table. Laughter that stopped the moment he walked into a room. Liam tried to ignore it, to keep his head down. But Mark was a predator, and he sensed Liam's vulnerability. The pranks escalated. His locker was filled with rotting garbage. Vile, homophobic slurs were scrawled across his locker in permanent marker. Someone created a fake social media profile in his name, posting embarrassing, photoshopped images and cruel comments about other students, turning the whole school against him. Liam went to the principal, a man named Dr. Evans, whose primary concern seemed to be the school's public image and the upcoming championship game. Dr. Evans listened with a distracted air. "Boys will be boys, Liam," he said, steepling his fingers. "Mark is a fine young man with a bright future. I'm sure it's all just a misunderstanding. Have you tried talking to him?" The system, the very institution that was supposed to protect him, had failed him utterly. The teachers saw nothing or chose not to see. The other students either joined in the torment or looked the other way, terrified of becoming the next target. Liam was completely, utterly alone. The hallways of Ridgeview, with their gleaming floors and motivational posters, became a gauntlet of terror. Every corner held the potential for humiliation. Every class a stage for his torment. The horror wasn't in a jump scare. It was in the slow, grinding erosion of his spirit. The breaking point came the week before homecoming. Liam had been working for months on a portfolio for a prestigious art scholarship. It was his ticket out, his hope for a future where he could be himself. He kept the large portfolio case in the art room, under the watchful eye of a sympathetic teacher, Ms. Gable, a different one, a kind-eyed woman who encouraged his talent. One afternoon, he walked in to find Mark and his friends there, helping the janitor. Mark held the portfolio. "Just admiring the art," Mark sneered, his friends snickering around him. "Give it back, Mark," Liam said, his voice trembling. "Or what?" Mark's smile was a cold, dead thing. "You'll draw me a picture?" And then, in a move of pure, calculated malice, Mark opened the large window overlooking the school's courtyard fountain. With a final, contemptuous look at Liam, he tossed the entire portfolio into the water below. Liam watched, paralyzed, as his dreams, his intricate charcoal portraits, his vibrant watercolor landscapes, months of painstaking work, sogged and dissolved into a pulpy, ruined mess in the chlorinated water. It wasn't just paper. It was his soul thrown away like trash. The laughter of Mark and his friends echoed in the sterile art room, a sound more terrifying than any ghostly moan. There was no justice here. There was no one to save him. The true horror was the realization that he was trapped in a world that not only allowed this cruelty, but, in its passive acceptance, actively enabled it. He was alone in a crowded school, and the monster wasn't under the bed. It was in the spotlight, cheered on by everyone. Back at Northwood, the horror was of a different, more ancient variety. The school was built on land that had a history, far older than the town itself. Mr. Henderson, the eccentric history teacher, would sometimes mention it in his lectures about local Native American tribes, speaking of spirits that guarded the woods and the thin places where the veil between worlds was fragile. Most students wrote it off as Henderson being Henderson, but a group of 4 friends, Jake, Sarah, Ben, and Maria, were about to learn the hard way that some stories are rooted in truth. It started as a dare. During Spirit Week, bored with the organized rallies and dress-up days, they decided to explore the one part of the school that was strictly off-limits. The network of steam tunnels that ran like arteries beneath the building. Rumor had it they were unstable, haunted, and had been sealed since the 80s after a maintenance worker disappeared. Jake, the de facto leader, had borrowed a key from his janitor father, One Tuesday night, under the cover of darkness, they slipped through a rusted, exterior access door into the earth. The tunnels were a claustrophobic maze of dripping pipes, cracked concrete, and shadows that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams. The air was hot, thick, and carried a strange coppery smell. They had been down there for maybe 20 minutes, their laughter echoing nervously when they heard it. A sound that was not a drip, not a creak, not a rat. It was a low, guttural chanting, a rhythm of words in a language none of them recognized. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, a vibration that crawled up their spines. "Okay, joke's over," Ben said, his voice shaky. "Let's get out of here." But when they turned to go back, the path they had taken was gone. The tunnel behind them was a dead end, a solid wall of crumbling cement that shouldn't have been there. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. They were lost. Their phones had no signal. The flashlights began to flicker. The chanting grew louder, more insistent. And then in the dancing shadows just beyond their failing light, they saw them. Figures not quite human, painted in soot and shadow, moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. They had no distinct faces, only the impression of antlers and hollow eyes. They were the echoes of the land's first people, but not their benevolent spirits. These were the guardians of a forgotten, angry god, the ones who had been disturbed by the concrete, and steel laid over their sacred ground. The entities didn't chase them. They herded them. Every time the friends tried to run, the tunnel would shift, corralling them deeper into the labyrinth, towards the source of the chanting. The air grew hotter, the coppery smell now unmistakably that of blood. Maria started to sob, her cries swallowed by the oppressive gloom. Finally, they were forced into a large, circular chamber they knew couldn't exist on the school's blueprints. In the center was a crude altar stone stained dark. The shadow figures surrounded them, their chanting reaching a fever pitch. Jake felt an overwhelming primal terror, the kind that bypasses the brain and speaks directly to the lizard stem. This wasn't a person trying to hurt them. This was a force of nature, an ancient hunger. As one of the figures glided towards Sarah, its shadowy hand outstretched, Ben, in a final act of desperation, remembered something Mr. Henderson had said. "The old ones respect fire," he'd mumbled once. It was their first tool, their first protection. "Fire!" Ben screamed. "They respect fire!" Jake, fumbling with trembling hands, pulled a Zippo lighter from his pocket. He flicked it open, the small, defiant flame sputtering to life. The moment the flame appeared, the chanting stopped. The advancing figures froze. The shadows seemed to recoil from the tiny point of light. Hissing like water on a hot stove, the tunnel behind them was suddenly clear. They didn't hesitate. They ran, stumbling and screaming. Back the way they came, the lighter held high like a talisman. They burst out of the access door into the cool, clean night air collapsing on the grass, gasping and crying. They never spoke of it again, not to each other, not to anyone. But they all carried the same unshakable knowledge. Their school was a shell, a modern facade built atop something old, hungry and very, very real. The true horror was the land itself, and it was still awake. The final story was the most intimate, the most psychologically devastating. It didn't happen in a single dramatic event, but over the course of a single agonizing semester. It was the horror of a shattered mind. Emma was a straight-A student, a perfectionist whose identity was built on a foundation of academic achievement. Her senior year, the pressure was immense. Valedictorian race, Ivy League applications, SATs, a full slate of AP classes. She stopped sleeping, surviving on coffee and adrenaline. Her friends noticed she was becoming withdrawn. Her notes increasingly frantic and disorganized. They told her to relax, to take a night off. But to Emma, relaxing was failing. The cracks began to show subtly. She started to believe her teachers were coding secret messages in their lectures. Instructions meant only for her. She became convinced that her history textbook was changing, that the paragraphs were rearranging themselves overnight to test her. She saw patterns in everything. The rust spots on a locker were a map. The dripping of a faucet was a coded message. Her decline accelerated rapidly. In the middle of a calculus exam, she suddenly stood up, her eyes wide with terror, and screamed that the numbers on the page were bleeding and whispering lies to her. She was escorted to the nurse's office, shaking and incoherent. The school nurse called it a panic attack. Her parents, worried but oblivious to the depth of the problem, put it down to stress. But for Emma, the world had become a hostile, sentient place. The fluorescent lights in the hallway hummed with malevolent intent. The faces of her classmates in her yearbook seemed to twist into grotesque, mocking sneers when she wasn't looking. She started writing in a journal, but the words weren't her own. They were a chaotic jumble of apocalyptic prophecies and paranoid ramblings, written in a hand that sometimes didn't look like hers. The climax came during a rehearsal for the school play. Emma had a minor role, but she stood on the stage. Under the hot lights and the vast, dark emptiness of the auditorium seemed to be watching her, judging her. The other actors' voices became a distorted, echoing chorus of condemnation. She looked out and saw not empty seats, but a silent, shadowy audience of faceless figures, all pointing at her. She didn't scream this time. She went perfectly still. Then, in a calm, flat voice that was utterly unlike her, she began to recite every single mistake she had ever made: a forgotten homework assignment from the 3rd grade, a misspelled word on a 7th grade essay, a slight against a friend in middle school. She listed them with terrifying precision, as if reading from a ledger kept by some cosmic accountant of failure. She spoke for 10 minutes without stopping, her body rigid, her eyes vacant. When she finally fell silent, she collapsed. She was rushed to the hospital. The diagnosis was severe psychotic break, a temporary but complete divorce from reality brought on by extreme stress and sleep deprivation. The horror of Emma's story wasn't a monster you could fight or a ghost you could banish. It was the horror of watching your own mind, the very instrument of your being, turn against you. It was the terror of realizing that the person you are can be utterly dismantled from the inside, and that the straight A student, the perfect daughter, the future valedictorian could be erased, replaced by a terrified stranger staring out from behind your own eyes. The most disturbing hauntings are not of houses, but of minds, and high school, for some, is the perfect crucible for that particular kind of hell.